Last week I was talking about conversion to Islam and how it can be measured and what some of its concomitants were in terms of people moving from one place to another as they converted. Today I want to start talking about what happens when a community grows prior to its becoming strongly institutionalized. In very broad terms, I think that there are three periods of conversion to Islam historically that are distinct. The one I'm talking about now, I'll get to others later in the course, is where the community that is growing through conversion is starting from no institutional structure at all. So that the process of conversion has, implications for how the community organizes itself and how the faith is understood by the converts. When you get to the second period of conversion, which I'll date roughly after 1200, you have the spread of Islam into new areas, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, the Balkans, India, Southeast Asia, even later, to some degree into China. But when Islam spreads there, it is spreading as a faith that already has a very elaborated structure. So that there you can get a contrast and indeed a conflict between the institutions or the outlooks of the people who are coming in and seeking to make converts and the outlook of the people who are actually converting. So you can get a conflict between the people, between the institutions that are already fixed and those that are particular to the new area. Then I'd say there's a third period of conversion, which is pretty much what's going on now, where you have a growth of the faith in the context of modern nation states, constitutions, electoral structures, so forth and so on. And there I would say you have another institutional challenge to the structure of the faith. So, and I hope to talk about all three of these in the course of the semester. But today I want to talk about the first one. Now, as you go from having a small group of people in Western Arabia around Muhammad, and then an expansion that saw over a course of 50 years, probably fewer than 1 million people becoming the ruling elite of a territory that stretched from Spain to Pakistan. The faith that 1 million people shared went from being unstructured to a large extent to having particular structures and views and so forth and so on. And a lot of this had to do with conversion. As a rule of thumb, I take it as a given that when people convert from one faith to another, they do not forget what they knew before. And that to some degree, their expectations of the new faith will mirror their expectations of the faith community that they left. So let's say you have you come from a religious community that has a very complex and detailed legal structure. And you convert now to a new religion that doesn't have a legal structure. Well, maybe you want it to have a legal structure because you're used to that. Or maybe you come from a faith that has a very clear structure of authority in terms of holy men whom you turn to. Well, you may expect that or desire to see that in the faith to which you convert. There's also the notion that sometimes people who change faith are looking in a new faith for the things that they looked for but did not find in the old faith. So what I'm stressing here is that Islam was being made by the people who became Muslims. It is not simply something that was thought of by Muhammad, elaborated by a handful of people around him, carried by the Arabs into a conquest area, and then it was sort of fully blown. But rather, it was made more by the people who were converting to the faith than by the Arabs who initially were the followers. I say more simply because there were so many more converts than there were Arabs. By 750, let us say, when the Umayyad dynasty is supplanted by the Abbasid dynasty, probably already by that time the Arabs were in the process of becoming a minority, if they were not already a minority. Certainly by 800 or 900, the Arabs are a minority that, I can't say a small minority because it's very hard to tell. Also by that time you're having Arabization, so that some people whose grandfathers or great-grandfathers would not have considered themselves Arabs were now speaking Arabic as a mother tongue and were considering themselves Arab. So Arabization and Islamization get combined in complex ways. So what happened then when people converted? If they had certain beliefs or certain expectations, how did that affect Islam? Well, for one thing, if they were Jews or Christians, they knew a lot of things about stories that appeared in the Quran. Now, from a Muslim point of view, what is in the Quran is the full, complete, and accurate Word of God. And it's not to be amended according to earlier revelations contained in the Old Testament or the New Testament. Nevertheless, as people tried to understand what the Quran meant, it was kind of automatic that they would be using lore that came from the Jewish or the Christian tradition to flesh out what they found in the Quran. To give you an example, the story of Adam and Eve. There is no Eve in the Quran. You have the story of Adam and his wife, but she isn't named. But the earliest commentaries on the Quran give her a name. She is Hawa, which is Eve. In the Quran, she does not tempt Adam with an apple. She is not, in other words, the instrument by which Adam falls in his obedience to God. But she becomes so in the interpretation of the Quran because that is the story that comes over from Christian and Jewish sources. And this sort of interpretation is called in Arabic tafsir. So that there are many, many different commentaries of the Quran. But the commentary, each commentary is called a tafsir. And these commentaries will contain lore that comes in from sources that are Jewish or Christian, not because an Arab necessarily went and read these sources, but because the people converting already knew these sources that they had known as Jews or Christians. They're bringing them in. Among the various categories of hadith that I've talked about, the sayings of the Prophet, there are a whole bunch of hadith that are known as Israeliyat, essentially Israeli hadith, and they are ones that come directly from Jewish lore. And we can identify 2 or 3 narrators who transfer this lore into the body of hadith. The Quran talks about certain stars on the horizon. In the hadith, someone goes to Muhammad and says, "What were the names of the stars on the horizon?" And he says, "I'll check and get back to you on that." And then he gets back to him and says, "Well, here are the names." Well, the names come out of the Hebrew Bible, because you have this movement of lore. Now, I think this is probably what happens in every religion, that you are going to get a carryover from other or earlier faiths into the religion. You'll find certainly in Christianity there's a tremendous amount of Judaism, but there it's explicit. In Buddhism you'll have a tremendous amount of Hinduism. In Hinduism you'll have a great deal of Vedic religion that was pre-Hindu, so forth and so on. And it comes about naturally as people move from one religion to the other. If you were a Jew and you converted to Islam, you were converting from a religion that had very, very elaborate laws to a religion that had initially rather few laws. So laws become elaborated in Islam. Is it in order for Islam to be like Judaism? Not really, but it's to give to the people who have come into Islam a feeling that they are getting from Islam some of the things that they expected from their prior faith. In Zoroastrianism, the religion of Iran, there was a tremendous concern for purity. So you get questions about purity that arise and are answered in hadith that seem to come in from a Zoroastrian background. Christianity, you get questions about details about Jesus and other characters of the Christian tradition who appear in the Quran. Now, the problem with a lot of this is who speaks for Islam? I've mentioned this before. That anyone who had known Muhammad is qualified in a technical sense as a source of information about him. Indeed, you go about 100 years after the beginning of the Hijra calendar in 622, and you get the last of the people who claim to have known Muhammad. They were people who claimed to be 100 years old. Say, yes, I knew the Prophet, and he said the following. These are not usually regarded as particularly reliable sources, but there are books that were written about the companions of the Prophet, known as the Sahaba. Divide the companions of the Prophet into categories. Those people who knew him for a long time, those people who saw him once but were of a younger generation, those people who lived at the same time but did not know Muhammad directly, and so forth. But what you don't have is a structure that says that there are certain specific individuals who are the people who are qualified to say what Muhammad stood for or what he said at moments when he was not speaking under the inspiration of God. This marks Islam off very distinctly from the three main religions in the area in which Islam expanded: Christianity, Judaism, and Zoroastrianism. Christianity had priests. Priests were appointed by bishops. Bishops were responsible ultimately to archbishops, and you had a structure where there were, above the archbishops, you had patriarchs. There were basically initially 4 patriarchs: Jerusalem, Alexandria in Egypt on the coast, Antioch in near the coast in northern Syria, and Rome. So you had 4 patriarchs. Then, after 300 AD, you have a 5th patriarch in Constantinople. In time, you get other patriarchs. You get an Armenian patriarch, you get a Russian patriarch, you get a Serbian patriarch, and so forth. But the notion of a patriarchate, of an individual who stands at the very top of a hierarchy, was well established in Christianity. The different patriarchs might hold different beliefs. So particularly the patriarch in Alexandria frequently held to a different theological point of view than the patriarch in Constantinople, or the patriarch in Rome, who was the Pope, would hold to a different belief. And most of the heresies or allegations of heresy in early Christianity come from these disagreements among patriarchs. And those disagreements are fleshed out by the question of who gets to appoint the bishops. So within a particular territory, one patriarch will claim the authority to appoint all the bishops there, and then they ordain the priests. In other words, you have a very clear notion of authority. In the east, that is, say, in the area of Constantinople, Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria, leaving aside what was going on in Rome, by the middle of the 300s, you had a set of rules. These are the apostolic canons, as they're called, and they were rules, or 85 of them, that were set down. And it's rather interesting to see what sorts of things they ruled on. In the first place, they were primarily rules that had to be adhered to by priests or bishops, by people who were holding a sacred post. They weren't primarily rules that applied to lay people. But they had to do with things like, you must distinguish between the property owned by the bishop and the property owned by the church, so that when the bishop dies, you don't find his relatives stealing property from the church, things like that. You should not make someone a bishop who has just converted the day before from a heathen religion. Unless, of course, God intervenes and makes a special dispensation allowing you to have someone go from being, a worshiper of Mars to being a priest and then a bishop. This, incidentally, is a recurrent thing. If someone is in a high religious status in religion A and converts to religion B, the idea that you could be of a high religious status in religion B is very appealing. You want to go from a high position to a similarly high position. And this could be a complication. But in specific instances that we know of, in Islam, we know of people who would go from having a high position as non-Muslims to having a high position in Islam. The most famous incident had to do with the man who was the high priest of a Buddhist monastery in northern Afghanistan. The monastery was known as No Bahar, which in Persian means new spring, as in the spring of the year. But it's actually a Sanskrit term a Nava Vihara, which means new Buddhist monastery. Vihara is a word for a Buddhist monastery. And the city of Mazar-e-Sharif in northern Afghanistan, the second largest city, or I think it's the second largest city in Afghanistan, was built around this monastery. And the hereditary chief monk of the monastery, from what little we know about him, was an extremely influential political and religious figure throughout Central Asia, because there appeared to have been a string of daughter monasteries that depended upon the central monastery in Afghanistan. Well, somewhere around maybe in the 730s, the date is not quite clear, the son of the head of the Buddhist monastery in northern Afghanistan, of the Nau-Bahar, converted to Islam and became essentially the bankroller, apparently, of a revolutionary movement that in the year 750 deposed the Umayyad Caliphate and established the Abbasid Caliphate, which, in the process of the 750s, moves its center to Iraq, and then in 761 completes building the city of Baghdad. Well, he seems to have raised the money for the revolution, and then he became the chief scribe of the new caliph, and then his sons became hereditary viziers, and essentially by the year 800, this family from a Buddhist monastic background in northern Afghanistan was the second most powerful family in the entire caliphate. So, if you work things right, you could move from the top of one community to another. We have some evidence, for example, in Iraq, that you had Zoroastrian figures who converted to Christianity instead of Islam, and then they would donate their lands. These would be landowners. There were not all that many Zoroastrians in Iraq, even though it was ruled by Persia. Most of the people of Iraq were Christians or Jews. So they would donate land to the church, and then they would build a monastery and may have themselves declared the abbot of the monastery. So now they could be in charge as Christian religious dignitaries of the same land that they had previously owned as Zoroastrian landowner. Well, the advantage is that Christian religious properties had a tax freedom. So instead of paying taxes to the new caliphate, they could take the same land, establish it as the lands of a monastery, and avoid the taxes. This is one of the ways in which Islam actually promoted Christianity inadvertently. But when it came to the Christians that had a structure, they were very particular about the character of the people who became bishops. Also in these apostolic canons you have peculiarities. One of them is that no one should become a bishop who eats meat with the blood in it. In other words, the kosher restriction which also becomes a Muslim restriction on eating meat only after the blood has been drained, apparently was a Christian practice when you go back to the 4th century AD. And anyone who did not practice that could not be a bishop. There were no rare steaks in the diocesan palace. They also would specify things that were meant to distinguish them from the Jews, like they could not bring oil into a synagogue for a lamp. Why a bishop would want to bring oil into a synagogue for a lamp is not clear, but if they did it, then they were to be deposed from office. They could not avoid marriage because they didn't like marriage. They could avoid marriage as a religious thing, but not out of a lack of desire to get married, which seems rather peculiar. But certainly in the Greek Orthodox Church, priests below the rank of bishop normally did marry. And the whole question of celibacy becomes a very vexed one. Why are certain religious categories supposed to be celibate and others are not supposed to be celibate? Same thing, if you, on a feast day, you could avoid eating meat if it was a religious requirement, but if you avoided eating meat because you didn't want to eat meat, then you were sinning. Whatever you did in the way of celibacy or meat avoidance, you had to do out of religious belief, not out of personal preference. Who is to tell? I mean, nevertheless, these are the sorts of canons that they had. We have nothing similar for Muslims. In other words, we don't have any rules that will specify how an authority in Islam is supposed to act, or indeed how you determine who's an authority in Islam. You had a caliph. The caliph would appoint governors. You got a more elaborate bureaucracy as time progressed, but most of the bureaucrats originally were not Muslims and did not keep their records in Arabic. It's only really after 750, when the Abbasids come to power, that you get the records being kept in Arabic, and the officials required to be Muslims. But these people were not religious authorities. It became common a couple of generations ago among scholars of the Middle East to say, well, you had the growth of pious circles. That is, say, groups of people who claimed that they were pious or were thought to be pious. But how could one identify a pious circle? They weren't clubs. They weren't. It wasn't apparent why someone would be known for piety and someone else would not. At least we have no set of rules on the matter. But it's become, well, it was at that time fairly common for people to say that the reason that the Umayyad dynasty fell after 100 years of rule was because the pious circles sapped it of authority, or it ran out of its moral authority because piety had moved away. These are extremely vague concepts. How do you measure that? I mean, we could do it with public opinion polling now, but how do you do it when it was 14 centuries ago and you have virtually no data? It becomes, like many historical arguments, kind of a punting on third down. You say something in order to make it, because it sounds sensible, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you can actually prove it in any way. And then there's the question of the Quran. Who knew the Quran? You have a book that was compiled that becomes the sacred book of a growing community, most of whom do not know Arabic, increasingly do not know Arabic. Even of those who know Arabic, are native speakers of Arabic, most of them cannot read. And so, what's the status of the Quran? A person who recites the Quran known as a qari, and we have some references to people who were Quran reciters. We don't know exactly what a Quran reciter, what the Quran sounded like. The type of cantillation of the Quran that we have today sounds very similar, well, at least it sounds similar, maybe not very similar, to Armenian church chanting or to Sephardic Jewish chanting. So people say, well, that the Quran must have sounded that way when it was recited from day one. But you could equally make an argument that the Christians and the Jews who converted to Islam were used to hearing their sacred liturgies recited in intoned in a particular form of chant. And they liked it better when they heard the Quran intoned that way. So that whether the cantillation, as it's called, whether the style of reciting the Quran that we have today, and we have global contests for Quran recitation that are really quite fabulous. There was a movie recently about such contests in Egypt, and for children, you see these kids coming from all over the Muslim world and chanting Quran. It's really very, very touching. But whether that was there in the time of the Prophet, or whether this is in fact an evidence of the desire of converts to hear their holy liturgies in something that they can understand, or that they can that their sounds religious to them, we don't know. Then there's a question of how much of the Quran did anybody ever hear? In principle, if you were to go to all of the writings of a particular religious figure and to take all of the quotations of the Quran that are there and look at the frequency of verses, you could determine sort of de facto which parts of the Quran were most appealing. And then you could go to another century, another figure, and you say, well, what were the parts of the Quran that were most appealing to this other person? And you could get a kind of sense of how much of the Quran was actually used and for what purposes. For example, when the practice arose of writing Quranic verses on amulets and rolling them up and putting them in a cylindrical case and hanging it around your neck as a protection against evil, the verses that show up are pretty predictable. Which ones are protections against evil? So, how much of the Quran anybody knew was, certainly not the whole thing. Some people would know the whole thing. If you memorize the entire Quran, you are called a hafiz. And by memorizing the entire Quran and getting the rank of hafiz, it meant not only could you recite it from the beginning, but if anybody opened at random and picked a verse and recited it, you could go on from there. You just had, you knew it that well. I discovered this when I was checking into a, let us say, very modest hotel in Oasis in southern Tunisia. And they wanted to know if I was a Muslim. And I said no. And they pointed out that I should be, and we had some disagreement on this. And eventually, a gentleman was produced from the back room and said, okay, point out a verse in the Quran, open it. Because they'd gotten me to open the Quran and said, read this aloud. I said, what happens to non-Muslims? And so I pick out a verse, okay, this verse. I said, so it says, such and such. And the guy would start reciting from there. And he was a hafiz. He was the waiter in the dining room. Being a hafiz did not make him it made him a source of pride for this hotel. But it didn't make him the manager of the hotel. So one of the things we know that people would do would be memorize the Quran. But there's very little information about texts of the Quran being distributed. You would think that when you read about certain areas that maybe there would be a note as to who brought the first Quran to such and such a city. You don't get that information. And in fact, we have vastly more information about people knowing hadith than we have about people knowing the Quran. So, what kind of distinction did people have? You can find out some of it by looking at the epithets that are attached to people's names in the biographical dictionaries at different periods. So what you find going back to let's say to the late 700s, the most common pietistic epithets are Zahid, which means an ascetic, someone who, purges evil things from his flesh, or abid, it means a pietist, and sometimes it will be spelled out that, it'll say, so and so, the abid, he wrote the Quran all day and stayed up all night. You're supposed, night vigils were good. Reading and copying the Quran was good. So we know that there were certain practices that gave people a reputation for being pious. But I think that in time, as you got more converts, people wanted not only someone who acted in a pious way. He was abstemious. You had some people we know of who were weepers, who would weep all the time for fear of the hellfire to come because of their sins. You even have one or two people who are called monks. Supposedly there are no monks in Islam, but in the Biographical Dictionary of Isfahan, you have a couple of people who are called rahib, meaning monk. Maybe there was one monastery there, sort of an effort to experiment with one. But in time, rather than simply having pious people who you might admire as Muslims, people were wanting people to look up to people who were knowledgeable. And it's this knowledge that becomes central to the elaboration of Muslim institutions. So you have the word ilm, modern word for science in Arabic, from a verb meaning to know. Plural of it is ulum, and ulum ad-din means the sciences of the faith. So the ulum are sciences, ulum ad-din are sciences of the faith. If ulum are simply mentioned without that in a medieval context, it normally would mean sciences of the faith. It's a religious sort of knowledge. The active participle from that verb is alim, which means a person who knows, a person who possesses ilm, and the plural of that is ulama. That becomes the standard word for the Muslim educated class. So the history of the growth of the Muslim community in the first 4 centuries, to the degree we can recover it at this level of trying to figure out how the society is organized, is a history of the rise of the ulama. The ulama were defined as people who were knowledgeable about the faith, and therefore people who could answer questions about the faith. The knowledge that they had was preeminently knowledge of hadith. That was how they found out about the faith. Of course, they would have read the Quran, but the principal source of knowledge about the faith outside of the Quran was the hadith. So here you had, growing up by the year 800 or so, a group of people in each community who were felt within that community to be the knowledgeable people about the faith. But they did not hold positions. Their knowledge was not certified by the government. There were no official ulama. There's a question of how they learned all of this, because you did not have a school system. We have massive amounts of information about people learning hadith from one reciter to a reciter of the next generation, but almost nothing about any institutionalization of this process. No schools, no degrees, no admissions, no fellowships, it's just no evidence of an institutionalization. It has been argued, and I think to some degree correctly, that because knowledge of the hadith was essentially a free good if you had the time and inclination to acquire that knowledge, that you had a great deal of social mobility in the first couple of centuries of Islam. That any Muslim who was pious could choose to devote his time to learning the hadith of the Prophet and becoming an alim. And then once he became an alim, he would be a source of honor for the community, a source of authority on religious matters to the Muslims in the community, and he would become a person of some stature. Some people have argued that scholarship in Islam, starting at that point, always reflects social mobility, and that becoming learned is the way to become important. I don't think that's true. I think that by the 900s, most of the ulama are the sons of the previous generation of ulama, and you simply don't have a tremendous amount of evidence of social mobility. Rather, the ulama gradually, in the 900s, become a class. But as a class, whether they are a hereditary class or a class distinguished by their learning, what is striking is the disconnect between what they know and the structure of government. And insofar as people who became Muslims thought of themselves as belonging to a faith community, there's certainly the appearance that the faith community, which did not have a formal ecclesiastical structure was more important than the political community. So they belonged to a political community. There was a caliph. You had an empire. The caliph commanded armies. The caliph expanded territory. The caliph put down rebels. But the caliph did not teach you the sciences of the faith. For that, you went to local individuals. Whether this was consistent across the empire is quite uncertain. For reasons that are not clear, the largest number of biographical dictionaries from the 9th and 10th centuries come from Iran and Spain. So it's in the most non-Arab extremes of the empire that the data on who became a learned person seems to have been collected most assiduously. But for Egypt and Syria, though at a later point a lot is collected for Syria, for Egypt, very little. For Syria, early on, not a whole lot. Quite a bit for Iraq. So this raises a question as to whether in what might be considered core Arab areas, Iraq, Syria, Greater Syria, meaning what is now Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Israel, whether in Iraq, Greater Syria, and Egypt, areas that shifted over to speaking Arabic earliest and had seemingly the largest number of ethnic Arabs settling in them, whether the institutionalization of the ulama was slower than it was in the more outlying areas in Iran, where people spoke Persian, which bears no relationship to Arabic, or in Spain, where people spoke Latin, or if they were part of the Visigothic establishment, a variety of German. There is another factor here, which is that the urbanization takes place differentially according to a similar pattern. In other words, urbanization in Iran is really dramatic. Urbanization in Spain, cities like Cordoba and Seville and so forth, is quite dramatic. But urbanization in Egypt, Syria, and Iraq, less so. Each of the garrisons that was established, the Fustat in Egypt, Kufa and Basra in Iraq, was next to an existing city, and the population of that city, non-Muslim, non-Arab city, sort of flowed into the new cities. And in Syria, we don't have any major city that was established as an Arab Muslim center. So the Umayyads ruled from Damascus from 661 roughly down to 750. But Damascus has no architectural legacy of that period, or very, very little. Damascus is already an important city, primarily populated by Christians. You had a cathedral in Damascus, but that was turned into a mosque and became the central mosque of Damascus, called the Umayyad Mosque. But you don't have a lot of other buildings. In Jerusalem, you had a structure built called the Dome of the Rock, which was sort of a Muslim taking possession of a Jewish holy area. Jews who had been expelled from Jerusalem in 70 AD are allowed for the first time in almost 600 years to return to Jerusalem. But you don't have Jerusalem becoming the site of many Muslim structures. There's no real Muslim archaeology for Jerusalem in this period. The same thing for Alexandria. Alexandria, almost totally ignored. Antioch, largely ignored. So the urbanization that you get in Egypt, Syria, and Iraq seems to have led to communities that had much larger densities of Christians and Jews than of Muslims, at least for a couple of hundred years. In Spain and Iran, it seems to be the other way around. You have cities that are built that almost from the beginning have very large populations of Muslims. And these are the places where the collection of data about education and hadith proceeds the most energetically. I think that the social ambience of these different provincial areas within the many provinces of the Caliphate reflects a differential in conversion. Conversion is slower in Egypt and Syria than it is in Iran. But it also, I think, reflects the fact that in Egypt and Syria, and to a large extent Iraq, you had an extensive Christian ecclesiastical structure that remains intact after the conquest to a large extent. And you don't have a competing structure that is specifically Muslim. So in other words, you continue to have patriarchs, you continue to have bishops, you continue to have priests, and those people who have not converted to Islam, who are Christians, follow their authorities. The Jews follow rabbis. And the Muslims don't have a alternative authority structure in these areas to compete with what was already there. I think it's also important that in these areas where you already had established major cities, the merchant class was non-Muslim. Now, by contrast, if you go to Iran, you had very small cities. You had a dramatic migration from the countryside to the city. The cities grew rapidly and phenomenally, and the cities became overwhelmingly Muslim cities. So that if you were to, let us say, look at Damascus, in the year 850, and a city like Isfahan in the same year, I don't know which one would be bigger, but you would probably get a much higher proportion of Muslims in Isfahan than you would in Damascus. These social distinctions, I think, are difficult to quantify, but I think they have a lot to do with the evolution of the state and of the interior structure of the Muslim religion. As long as, you'd had, of course, a caliphate established in the immediate aftermath of the Prophet's death. You had 4 caliphs and then a civil war. The civil war ended in 661 with the assassination of Ali, who was the 4th caliph. And then you had the Umayyads taking over under the Caliph Muawiyah. A very strange name. It means howling bitch in Arabic. But people explain that as being reflecting a practice of giving children pejorative names in order to ward off the evil eye. You know, you have a child and you say, "Oh, little stinker," and then, you know, the evil eye is not going to focus on little stinker, but rather on, you know, cute little Rosie over here, and she'll be cursed forever. But be that as it may, the Umayyads start with Muawiyah, who wins his tussle with Ali, and they rule there in Syria from Damascus until they're overthrown by the Abbasids in 750. I don't want to leave the impression they did not build buildings, but they didn't build them in the cities. What we have from that period are very largely palaces out in the desert. It seems that the Umayyads, the caliphs, and the ruling family liked to hang out with other Arabs rather than hang out in Damascus where there were all these Christians and Jews around. Who knows what their tastes were exactly, but they lavished a great deal of architectural effort and money on these rural palaces and the surrounding fields that from which the palaces sustained themselves. And for Iraq, which was their second most profitable province, the caliphs never went to Iraq. They might go to Egypt, but they did not go to Iraq. In Iraq, they would have a governor and who would be sort of a viceroy, and he would be in charge of Iraq and everything to the east. Some of these viceroys were as powerful as caliphs, but they were always subordinate to the caliph. One of the most famous examples an Iraqi governor named al-Hajjaj, at a certain point during his governorship, he noted that there was someone who caused a turmoil in the mosque because on Friday, when there would be prayers for the caliph at the noon prayer, the so-called khutbah, there would also be curses called on Ali, who had been the enemy of the Umayyads. So if you were a Shiite who was favorable to Ali, it was common to pick up stones and throw them at the guy who was giving the prayers. And so we read about in a certain year the courtyard of the mosque was paved in order to get rid of the pebbles that they were picking up. But there was one person who was particularly obstreperous, and he was sent, he was a problem, so the governor sent him to Damascus to be judged by the caliph rather than do it himself. So in things like that, we can see that even though you had powerful governors in Iraq, they deferred to the caliph for the things that required the most political authority. After 750, when the caliphate shifts from Syria to Iraq, which isn't very far, and in fact, if, you know, all you have to do is go across all that land occupied by ISIS, and you get from one to the other. It's not literally very far. But from 750 on, the new caliphs of the Abbasid family never go to Egypt, much less anywhere further west. They don't go to Syria very often. They go to Iran. So the Umayyads never went to Iran. The Abbasids never went to the west. And indeed, at that time, the word west as a general term included Egypt. Nowadays, it includes only North Africa, but Maghrib, the word for today for North Africa, included Egypt at the time. So there's a clear change in the center of power and the center of attention of the Islamic political structure that occurs around the year 750 when you have the overthrow of the Umayyads. For the next 200 years, Iran is far more important than any other area. And I think this reflects, in part, the fact that Iran had developed a more elaborate Muslim religious authority structure than the other areas had. First, because the cities in Iran were new and were predominantly Muslim, therefore you had a greater critical mass there to establish some sort of hierarchy of faith. And then secondly, because the people in Syria and Egypt were always suspected of being still loyal to the Umayyads, and therefore not necessarily very reliable. But curiously enough, in the early 900s, or indeed the late 800s, the authority of the caliphate begins to diminish. If you look at the curve of conversion that I've constructed, this fading of the caliphate coincides with about the 50% point in conversion to Islam. And I've proposed an argument that would explain this. Though not an argument I can readily substantiate. Before 850 or so, the revolts that occurred in the east, the area that the Abbasids were most interested in, are revolts that seem to be related to pre-Islamic religions. They seem to be related to Zoroastrianism or to one of the variants of Zoroastrianism that were historically attested. And you would have an army from the caliphate would go from Baghdad or from one of the local garrisons and put down the revolt. And some of the revolts gained a great deal of power for brief periods of time. One of the most famous was a man named al-Muqanna, and he right around the year 800 or so, a little bit after, he led a revolt out in the area of Samarkand, in what's now Uzbekistan. And he wore a veil so that nobody knew what he looked like. And it was in the province of Khorasan. So he came to be referred to as the veiled prophet of Khorasan. A caliphal army traveled out to Uzbekistan, surrounded him, laid siege to his fortress, and burned it to the ground, but his body was never found. And so no one really knew what he looked like. This story became retold again and again. And there was an Irish poet in the late 18th century named Thomas Browne, who wrote a long story poem Lalla Roch. I'm not sure I've spelled that correctly. And one of the tales in Lalla Roch is the tale of the veiled prophet of Khorasan. You can find it online on Professor Fran Pritchett's website. She has the entire poem there. You can go there and read about the veiled prophet of Khorasan. You think, well, why does anyone care? Well, La Roque was an incredibly popular poem in the 19th century. So when the city of St. Louis decided they wanted to compete with New Orleans with a Mardi Gras type celebration, they decided they would have the Veiled Prophet Ball and Parade every year. So they started to have the Veiled Prophet of Khorasan becomes the center of society life in St. Louis. It continues down to the present day. Every year there is a Veiled Prophet Parade and a ball, and the, you know, the FF, you know, SL, the First Families of St. Louis, belong to the Veiled Prophet Society, and one of the men wears a veil and he's the Veiled Prophet, and then there's his lady and so forth and so on. So, is anyone here from St. Louis? Good, so I don't think I misrepresented anything, because you can't prove it to the otherwise. Oddly enough, in the, you know, it wasn't all good memories of the Veiled Prophet of Khorasan, because in the early 20th century, one of the great racist writers in English, a guy named Sax Rohmer, Englishman whose real name is Arthur Saxby Ward, he wrote the Fu Manchu novels, you know, about how the Yellow Peril is going to kill all the white people in the world. And in The Mask of Fu Manchu, an archaeologist goes out to Central Asia and discovers the mask that El Muqanna wore. And if the evil Chinese genius, Dr. Fu Manchu, should get hold of the mask and put it on, then all of the millions of brown Muslim people around the world would rise up and kill the white people. So it's very important for the British heroes to, you know, your mission, capture the mask, destroy Dr. Fu Manchu. It's, you know, great stuff. It's not irrelevant to mention these offshoots, because the stories of these revolts continued for centuries. They were memorable, even though we don't know much about the details. They entered into the local mythology of, particularly of Iran. But after the early 800s, you don't have any cessation of revolts. It's just that by the middle of the 800s, the revolts are within Islam. Instead of having something to do with Zoroastrianism or some offshoot of Zoroastrianism, the revolts become Muslim revolts. A warlord who seizes control of a city and keeps the taxes for himself, again, vis-a-vis other warlords who want to do the same thing. At that point, the caliphate really disappears. And instead you have Iran being divided up from the roughly the 830s onward into a series of smaller states that nominally recognize the caliph, but really rule independently. And I think that there's a correlation between the decline of the caliphate and the rise of conversion. So that when the Muslims are either a very small or a moderately small minority, there's always a fear that they will be overwhelmed by the majority population. But once the Muslims become the majority, the need to have an army to call upon to come and save them from a non-Muslim revolt, that need declines. And so the central, the idea that we must be loyal to the caliph because he will come and protect us if there is a danger to Islam, that feeling diminishes. And instead you have the feeling that, well, here you have two warlords, each of whom wants to rule, but they're both Muslims, and what's the basis for choosing between them? The caliph is not going to involve himself in going off and fighting one Muslim army as opposed to another Muslim army. What seems to give some substance to this is the correlation in the history of Islam in Spain about a more in the mid-900s and in the mid-800s of the same sort of thing. That you have a centralized state in Spain, but that state falls apart in the mid-900s, which is roughly when you get over the halfway mark of conversion in Spain, according to my calculations. So what seems to be involved is that as Islam becomes increasingly hegemonic within a society, the political function diminishes, and the, let us call it the ideological or the, well, say ideological function increases, but the people who are the guardians of the ideological function, the way in which the faith guides people in their lives and becomes a source of authority for them, the leaders of that are the ulama, who do not hold positions in the state. So the rulers, the political rulers and the generals whom they employ, they diminish in importance as time goes on, whereas the ulama increase in importance as time goes on. This is an example of what I've been trying to talk about, that the proportion of a religious group within a multi-confessional community has a great deal to do with the way in which that faith is experienced and structured. Now, the ulama, whom I will be talking about more on Thursday, are the people who know about Islam. They know the Quran, they know the Hadith, they know interpretation of the Quran, they know about chanting the Quran, they know a great deal of stuff about Islam. They've acquired it without having a formal school system, which still remains somewhat mysterious how that happened. But they are otherwise ordinary citizens. Unlike the Christian clergy, they are not celibate. Indeed, it's considered a highly commendable thing for men to marry, and pretty much a necessary thing for women to marry. They're not celibate. They're not paid for their knowledge. It seems that through the at least the early 800s, we have some evidence of people reciting hadith and refusing payment for it. You do have instances where a father will go to a particularly important hadith reciter and say, "Would you teach my son the hadith? And by the way, here's a turkey for your Thanksgiving." And, it's a certain amount of bribery or gifts and so forth. But then you have people who refuse that. And I'm stressing this because at a later point, all this becomes institutionalized in the school system. But there is this kind of irony that the most outstanding scholarship in Islam takes place before there is a school system, which could raise the suggestion that universities are a mark of decline of education, and that when admissions criteria and graduation criteria and grade point averages and exams take precedence over learning, that the average quality of learning goes down. I wouldn't make that argument, of course, but if I heard someone else make it, I would probably nod, yes, I think that's probably true. But far from it for me to complain about the institution that I've worked in for the last God knows how many years. But you do have this interesting situation which sets Islam apart from the religions that it is growing up among. The Christians have their hierarchy. The Jews have a very tight community structure centered around rabbis, although they don't have a hierarchy of rabbis. Each community has its own local structure. The Zoroastrians have priests who tend to the fire altars that are the central ritual of their faith. But in Islam, you have a faith community that's increasingly focused on the substance of the religion and on the people who are knowledgeable about the faith. And yet, it remains comparatively unstructured, down to 900 or so. So I'm going to talk more about that, the question of structure and education on Thursday.